It's horse beef! Hey, what the fuck was that? I'm talking about retired fighters, and I want to see, theoretically, hypothetically, whatever you want to use, whatever word you want to use, how they would do against the current roster. So I've picked out not every single fighter to ever retire from the sport because this list would get absurdly long, but I think I've picked out some of the most intriguing one. And yeah, I just want to have a little conversation with myself and, of course, with you guys in the comment section. I know you guys love to leave your thoughts, and I feel like this is one of those topics that leaves a lot of room open for discussion. So feel free to continue the conversation in the comment section like I know you guys like to do. But I feel like the ground rules are laid out pretty clearly. Early retirement, journeyman, top 15, top 5 champion, right? It's all conjecture. Very little facts based in this, but I feel like some of them kind of rank themselves. But let's just see how we get into it. I haven't even really put much thought into where I would rank each individual fighter, so we're just gonna go based off of vibes, man. Dan Henderson. Now this dude, good wrestler, no neck, crazy chin, crazy power, slung hammers. Could have competed at 185 or 205. Has competed at both weight classes. So I feel like whichever one. I feel like 205ers right now are just too big. He would be massively undersized, so I feel like he'd have to go down to 185. And how would he do against the current 185ers? I feel like he'd do okay, man. That power, the experience of Dan Henderson, the tenacity, the chin, the toughness, just everything. I love Dan Henderson. I feel like he could, at this current stage, be a top 15 fighter. I feel like technique has just improved to such an extent to where fighters like Dan Henderson, like old school hard-nosed brawlers like Dan Henderson, they have a chance in every fight, but as technique gets better and better, there's an ever-increasing chance that he's just going to get sniped in every single one of his fights. At 185, like he'd have to go against guys like DDP, man. DDP is kind of like an updated version of Dan Henderson when we really get down to it. But I feel like I rate him to at least break into the top 15. Yoel Romero, any version of Yoel Romero, but this is based on prime versions. How would he do, man? I would pay big money to see a banger between DDP and Yoel Romero. No, I think as things stand, dude, prime Yoel Romero would be a top 5, I think, in the current middleweight standings. I mean, who's really up there? As I said, Cal Baralho. We saw Izzy. We saw Yoel Romero against Izzy. Didn't look that impressive, man. Yoel Romero was just a nightmare for anybody because everyone was scared of Yoel Romero. Everyone was scared to engage him, except for the absolute Chad that is Robert Whittaker, of course. Went to war with Yoel Romero, prime Yoel Romero, which happens to be like pushing 40 Yoel Romero, which makes no sense. Honestly, I am scared to even think about what we would have seen if Yoel Romero discovered MMA at a younger age and started maybe in his like mid-20s, and we got to see him compete from his mid-20s into his like mid-30s, late 30s. Holy shit, man. I feel like Yoel Romero would have 100% been a champion at that point, one of the best fighters of all time to never win a title, and he's really not that far removed from the current middleweight roster, so I feel like surely he would be able to compete and be ranked among a similar location, although I still feel like DDP would beat him up when it comes down to it, and I don't think he'd be able to become champion, but I think he's good enough to be a top 5 fighter. Vanderlei Silva. Now, would the style of Vanderlei Silva hold up at 185 or 205? I think, as I said with Dan Henderson, he'd be too small as a 205er and would get beat up, so he'd have to be a 185er, and I don't really know, dude. He was so sloppy with his hands, would just sling from the hip, and I definitely see him getting chinned by a lot of these guys at 185 nowadays if you're going to fight that sloppily. But I think he does have that puncher's chance. The clinch should be deadly. A lot of these guys would just shoot for his legs, though. They're all so well-rounded. But fighters like Roman Dolidze are in the top 15. So, yeah, Vanderlei Silva would be a top 15 fighter 100%. I don't know if I would expect him to be as highly ranked as Dan Henderson. I feel like Dan Henderson's style, it just is more timeless than one like Vanderlei Silva's, but I still think he would be in a similar ranking when it comes down to it. Then we get into George St. Pierre, and I'm going to stick him right in champion. I think if you put a prime George St. Pierre in that current welterweight landscape, George St. Pierre becomes a champion 100%. I think he cleans it out, man. I think he beat Shavkat. I think he toys with Bilal. Truly, I think he toys with Bilal. He's just so advanced. He's so far ahead of his time that I feel like current welterweights still haven't been able to match the well-rounded skill set of GSP, the jab and the double leg alone would be enough to beat a majority of current welterweights. And there's all this talk about Bilal being so great because he displayed a great jab and great takedowns against Leon Edwards. But George St. Pierre became the greatest mixed martial artist of all time with those exact weapons. As I said, jab, multiple variations of the jab, right? Best jab of all time in MMA, and beautiful double leg, along with the fact that he had an amazing striking skill set, great kickboxing, excellent kicks, good hands too. Like, GSP is just the greatest fighter ever, and he was gritty. He displayed amazing grit against Johnny Hendricks on fucking rocket fuel, dude. Seriously. George St. Pierre would be a champion. He would clean the entire division. Prime Usman, see you later. You know what I mean? Like, they're all just worse versions of GSP at the top of the game right now, at the top of welterweight especially. All these guys are just worse versions of GSP, and they would not hold a candle to him even to this day. And I think that speaks to how ahead of his time GSP really was. Seriously, this man was just ahead of the game. So many steps ahead. Then we get into Matt Hughes, same weight class, but I just feel like he's not well-rounded enough for this current generation of fighters. Right, I don't see him beating a lot of guys. I know he did beat some top competition back in his day. I don't know if he would be quite as good, though. Would he be a top 15 fighter? Very possibly. I think with that wrestling, he would be, because we do see pretty one-dimensional wrestlers make it to the top. As I've said, we see Bilal up there right now, and I know some people may have the illusion that he isn't one-dimensional because he landed a few jabs on Leon Edwards, but he is absolutely a very one-dimensional fighter, just as Matt Hughes was. So if Bilal's becoming a champion, I see no reason why Matt Hughes can't at least break into the top 15 against the current roster of UFC welterweights. And then we get into Vitor Belfort. Now it's kind of up in the air where he would fight. I mean, it would be between 185 and 205. Would be too small for 205, as I've said. I know he did fight John Jones, but he looked a lot smaller. But if we're talking about TRT Vitor, then you fucking put him at heavyweight. And I can see him doing a job against a few of those guys. But it's hard to say, because if we're considering prime Vitor, is that young Vitor or is that TRT Vitor? I don't really know. The picture is TRT Vitor, so we'll just weigh it up as such. I'd say top 15 would be pretty likely. Randy the Natural Couture, however you say his name, I don't really know. Yeah, this is a tough one for me, because I do rate him, right? He's one of the greatest martial artists of all time, like 6-time champion, 2 weight class champion, fought in a much simpler time though. And I feel like if he was at heavyweight, he would get knocked out quite often. Heavyweights are just so big nowadays. Even at 205, he wouldn't be a very big dude even for 205 standards nowadays, and he'd have to fight against well-rounded fighters, where he was always just more of a gritty, hard nose, get into range, collar tie, uppercuts, takedowns. It's really all he had. I don't want to disrespect him at all. I don't want to disrespect him. But I feel like his style, for today's standards, is a bit outdated. Fuck, man, I don't really know. But if I'm putting Matt Hughes there, why wouldn't Randy Couture be able to compete at 205 at least top 15? Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think Randy Couture could. Like a prime Randy Couture, I believe that he could compete in the top 15. Then we get into Artem Lobov, man, the Russian Hammer. Get out of here, bro. This guy, I don't really know what to say about him. I really don't know what to say, but I'm just going to put him at early retirement. I feel like his career was dragged out a little bit in the UFC, but as things have improved, as skills have improved, technique, right, overall, it doesn't matter what division he was competing at, he would get his clock cleaned out in every single fight. Good thing for him, though, he had a crazy chin, but some of the funniest looking arms to torso ratio I've ever seen in my life. But Artem Lobov would be retired absolutely. And then we get into Anderson Silva. Now, this is a very tough one to choose. Do I think he would be champion? I actually have no idea. I really don't have an idea, because he always struggled against grapplers. And at the top of 185, you have a guy like Dricus du Plessis, who mixes it up, who can do everything, right? Power in the hands and a nasty grappler. And I do feel like Anderson Silva would struggle against some of these top guys, especially with his style, right? The sort of laid back, stylistic style, whatever the fuck that means, that Anderson Silva did have. He'd sit back against the cage and all that, put himself in vulnerable positions to try and counter his opponent, But yeah, as fighters started to wise up to that later on in Anderson Silva's career, it kind of just got him hurt, and led to him losing a majority of his fights towards the end of his career. And if he came in with that same energy against a lot of the top 5 middleweights as things stand, I don't think he would become a champion. But I could see him very easily breaking into the top 5 of 185. Now, I'd like to put him in front of Yoel Romero. There we go. Yeah, Anderson Silva would be right on the cusp. I believe he could challenge for a title. I'm just not too sure if he would be a champion in the current age. And then we get into Chuck Liddell, 205er, and I think he'd be quite a small 205er for today's standards, as I've said about a lot of these old school fighters, and that really is the difference. Like that is a massive difference maker. Of course, as MMA evolves, technique, skill, well-rounded skill sets will start to emerge, and I guess one-dimensional, you could call Chuck Liddell a one-dimensional fighter, but he kind of wasn't. He just chose to be. He was sort of like a light heavyweight Justin Gaethje, in the sense that he was great at sprawling and defending takedowns, but then on the feet, he would just sling hammers, right? It was just massive flurries on the feet, and I don't think that he would do too well at 205 nowadays. I think he would be knocked out quite often, and I don't think that he'd be a champion. I don't think he'd be a top 5er, but top 15, very, very possibly for Chuck Liddell. And then we get into the master of the English language, that is Tito Ortiz. Now, this is a tough one, but I'm going to put him in journeyman. I don't think he'd retire early, but I just feel like his style, as I said about Randy, he just would be very small for 205, so he may have to cut down to 185. Down there, I feel like he'd be too diminished because of the weight cut and get chinned. Yeah, I don't know. Just too one-dimensional for me. If all you have is wrestling, then I just don't really rate you to compete with the top of a new generation. Not just a new generation, but multiple generations ahead of him. I think he would be a journeyman. If you want to be a one-dimensional wrestler, then you have to be someone like Khabib. You have to be as durable and as marauding as someone like Khabib. So yeah, I don't rate Tito Ortiz's chances of competing and breaking it into the top 15 of modern day 185ers or 205ers really. And then we get into Shogun Rua, another small 205er. How would he compete against the current roster? I mean, like we did kind of see him against current 185ers, or sorry, current 205ers. I was thinking about Potieria, who's now a 185er, but I believe fought him at 205 and finished him, unfortunately. But yeah, Shogun Rua, a prime Shogun, how would he do? I believe just as well as these guys at top 15. So I'm going to say top 15. I struggle not to put him as a top 5 guy, though. But as a 205er, just too small right now. Too small as things go. I'm juggling with the idea of putting a prime Dan Henderson in the top 5, dude. Man, should I put him there at 185? Would he be up there? You know what? Goddamn right he would. I'm putting him ahead of Yoel Romero. Dan Henderson is a top 5 man. Lyoto Machida. This is a very tough one because his style was very unique, and I feel like a lot of fighters haven't really been able to even replicate it to this day. And I do think that at 185 and 205, he would give a lot of these dudes trouble on the feet. He really would, right? He even gave someone like John Jones trouble. I believe he provided the first real test to John Jones on his way up, and a prime Lyoto Machida, I think, would be a really, really hard matchup for a lot of the division. I honestly feel like his style is almost more future-proof than a lot of these guys that I put down here in the top 15. So I'm going to say that Lyoto Machida would be a top 5 fighter. I think he would. I think that style still hasn't really been figured out to this day. Obviously, you just want to shoot on his legs and then call it a day, right? But it was never as simple as that against Lyoto Machida because his footwork was so elite and there was always the threat of a counter shot. I think he'd be a top 5 fighter. Cain Velasquez. I'm trying to think. Yeah, Aspinall right now. John Jones up there. Yeah, I don't believe he'd be a champion, but a prime Cain Velasquez, though. Nah, prime Cain Velasquez. Nah, he'd be a champion. He would be a champion. Him versus this current prime version of Tom Aspinall that we have would be so interesting to see. I still think Tom would win, but at the same time, you never know. Prime Cain was different gravy, and a lot of people forget about that. But I do think that he would be a champion as things stand. Robbie Lawler, comparing him to a lot of current top 170-pound fighters, I rate him. I rate his chances. The man was a beast. He was always a beast and beat some of the top guys at 170 back in the day. I think he would beat Leon Edwards. I think he would give Bilal Muhammad a really tough fight. But after what we saw Colby Covington do to him, but that wasn't out of prime Robbie Lawler. Maybe a prime Robbie would have been able to do a lot better against Colby Covington and in turn do very well against Bilal Muhammad. But I still think he would struggle. I don't really rate current 170-pound guys. Imagine prime Robbie against like a JDM, dude. That would be such a sick fight. And there's a chance that Robbie could get that one done. Even him versus Shavkat would be a tough fight for Shavkat. I think prime Robbie Lawler would be top 5 in this current 170-pound landscape. I just don't know if the talent pool is as great as maybe some people think it is. I don't know. I'm not too hot on some of the top welterweights. If Leon Edwards is up there, I believe that Robbie could easily be there. Mirko Cro Cop, he would be a heavyweight, which would be tough. And we did see him in the UFC, but out of his prime, knocked out by Brendan Schaub, man, just left a sour taste in my mouth. I don't think he'd be a journeyman, but I think a prime Mirko Cro Cop. Like, I don't think we understand how devastating he really was as a fighter. And if he was cutting down to 205, I think he'd be a problem. I do think he'd be a problem. He'd be one of the best strikers in that division right now. Yeah, man. Yeah, especially if Mirko Cro Cop cut down to 205, he would be a top 5 fighter 100%. If we're talking about heavyweight Cro Cop, maybe he wouldn't do quite as well than if he went down to 205. But if we're talking about 205, 100% top 5 fighter. Fedor Emelianenko. Would he be able to capture heavyweight gold? I guess it's a bit contradictory to say that Kane would and also Fedor would, but I guess you have to consider them both as separate in this instance, right? Like we're not thinking of it as like a prime Fedor and a prime Cain Velasquez competing at the same time. You know what I mean? But maybe for the same reason, I can give it to Fedor because Fedor was so good, man, and prime Fedor was undefeated for like 9 years. You know what I mean? The man was considered one of the best fighters in the world despite never competing in the UFC for a reason, because anyone paying attention to him understood how good he was. Would Fedor have been a champion in the UFC? Or sorry, would he have been the champion in the UFC competing right now against current UFC heavyweights? I think he's that good. He showed grit, he showed toughness. Sambo master. Would he be a champion, dude? I don't know, man. I just don't know. Do I put him up here? Nah, I think he'd just about be a top 5 fighter. Man, I'm going to get some hate in the comments for that one from Fedor fans. And I don't blame you either, man. I really don't. Then we get into Bas Rutten. Now, I was speaking about GSP because he's one of the biggest, like, ahead of their game type fighters. When you go back, you watch GSP back then, you could easily insert everything you're looking at into today's landscape as far as the skills that he's displayed. And I feel like something similar can be said about Bas Rutten. He was such a good, well-rounded mixed martial artist. I genuinely do think that if you take him and you put him against current 205ers, which is where he would likely be fighting, he would have success, right? He was a pioneer of a lot of things. He was almost like a leg kick pioneer. He has leg kick finishes, pioneered the liver shot as well. He, in many respects, is a pioneer of many, many techniques. And I believe that he was ahead of his game. Go watch old Bas Rutten footage. This dude was seriously ahead of his game. He was, man. He had great striking, and he was no joke on the ground either. Had legitimate grappling skills. Bas Rutten is that dude, and I think he'd be a top 5 guy. I really do think so. A prime Bas Rutten in today's landscape, I think, would do damage. Dan Severn. Now, this is a problem because I know Dan Severn is a legend. His style just doesn't hold up, and I don't even think he'd be a journeyman. I think he would be retired early. Now, I shouldn't even have Artem Lobov here because now that you have Dan Severn and Artem Lobov in the same tier, it makes it seem like I'm kind of ranking them in the same region, but that's just not the case because Dan Severn is a genuine legend and Artem Lobov is a meme. So them being in the same tier does not mean that I believe that they're as great as one another or on the same level. It's just in respect to how I believe that their skills would hold up, and I just don't think that Dan Severn is good enough. Like if you apply that old school style that he had, just pretty much flat-footed, plodding forward, looking to clinch and get your opponent to the ground. That's literally all he did. I believe he would be chinned in pretty much every single fight with that style when you apply it to today's standards. Yeah, I don't think Dan Severn would do very well today with the improvement overall on technique. No, he would be in big trouble for sure. And then we get into Chris Lytle, just an overall slugger. Hard to say how well he would have done, but I think he'd be a journeyman at the end of the day, right? He would swing from the hip, not a lot of technique in it. And Jens Pulver, the guy is a Hall of Famer. Do I think he'd do well, though? I think he'd probably do better than Chris Lytle. I think he could break into the top 15. Dude was just a brawler, slung hammers. Same argument as with Chris Lytle, but I think he's just a bit better, a better version of Chris Lytle at the end of the day. And then we get into Jacare Sousa. Now, we did get to see him perform against some current middleweights, right? Robert Whittaker got fucked up, right? But how would he do? I mean, like, we already have pretty much like a regen of Jacare currently competing at 185 in Gregory Rodriguez, and he's struggling to break into the top 15 right now. But I don't think it'd be much different. I think Jacare would be a top 15 fighter in the current 185 landscape. Chael P. Sonnen. If we're being completely honest right now, Chael P. would be a fucking journeyman. He arguably was a journeyman, right? He was such a good trash talker that he somehow convinced the world that he was worthy of fighting Anderson Silva and John Jones. Amazing. It's honestly amazing what a silver-tongued devil like Chael Sonnen can achieve with only his mouth. Pause.
No class.
That was a nasty line.
No class. No class.
Moving on. Kenny Florian here. I think he'd be a journeyman too. But he had some legit skills. He really did. He was a good featherweight. Got chewed up by Jose Aldo, and then I think retired shortly after. It's hard to say with Ken Flo because he showed good skills, but it's not great longevity. Would his skills hold up? I think they would hold up to an extent, but featherweights are so good right now. I don't think he'd even be a top 15 guy. I think he'd be a journeyman and pushing the boundaries of early retirement. Daniel Cormier. So we're talking about either 205 or heavyweight. Champion, 100%. I think you put a prime Daniel Cormier against Alex Pereira. If he gets to Alex's legs, he does him pretty dirty. And I think you even see a Tom Aspinall versus prime tubby Daniel Cormier, right? The Daniel Cormier that beat Stipe Miocic. I think he would give Aspinall a run for his money, but I'm not too sure if he would beat Aspinall. But if we're talking about prime 205 DC, champion 100%, I believe. Igor Vachavchin, heavyweight 205, doesn't really matter. The guy was 5'8" though. Just a small, stocky ball of power. Just take people's lights out. This man was such a power puncher, so scary. Would he hold up though? I think he would, dude. I'm thinking top 15 for Igor Vachavchin. Royce Gracie, early retirement, dude. This isn't meant to be a disrespectful thing towards Royce Gracie, the Gracies, or jiu-jitsu, even though I think jiu-jitsu is generally, like, on its own, kind of like a gay martial art, like probably the gayest of all the martial arts when you come down to it. Just like jiu-jitsu nerds think that they're dangerous weapons because they can lay on their back and butt scoot towards you, you know what I mean? But jiu-jitsu combined with other skills, right? Great stand-up and wrestling to go along with it. Jiu-jitsu is an amazing martial art to complement those other martial arts, but on their own, if you're just a straight jiu-jitsu guy, you're going to have your face pounded. We saw that with Ryan Hall. It just doesn't work anymore, right? It doesn't matter how good your jiu-jitsu is. It just doesn't work to the same extent that it did back in the day for Royce Gracie. A legend 100%, but he would get fucked up by today's fighters. Brock Lesnar. Now, I actually believe that he would be a top 5 fighter against today's heavyweights. He would, right? He was athletic, powerful enough, and had good enough wrestling to where I believe that he could beat a lot of the current top 5 heavyweights. Although Tom Aspinall would make quick and easy work of him, I still do think that like a prime Brock Lesnar, right? That first title run Brock Lesnar, he would do some dirty things to some top 5 heavyweights. I truly do believe so. He would give a hard fight to anybody, even Tom Aspinall, just because of how much of a physical force Brock Lesnar has always been. And then we get into BJ Penn. It's a tough one to say because he's such an interesting fighter. In his prime, he was so good, but his prime didn't last too long. Now did it? Do I think he could break into the top 15? I mean, would he be a lightweight? Do lightweights? Current lightweights would fuck him up, I think. Current welterweights, I think, would have a fucking easy time with him too, man. Honestly, when I'm thinking about it, I don't know how well BJ Penn would do against current lightweights or 170-pound guys, but I feel like he had the skill set in his prime to at least break into the top 15 of either of those two divisions, but I don't see him getting anywhere near the top 5, let alone becoming champion against current fighters. Yeah, he'd get fucked up. I do think he'd get fucked up pretty bad. Don Fry, I love Don Fry, right? I feel like Sean Strickland is like the reincarnation of Don Fry, but fights nothing like him. Don Fry was mostly a wrestler, but the dude would just compete in everything. He even fucking competed against that big-ass French dude. What the fuck was his name? Jerome LeBanner. He fought LeBanner and got knocked the fuck out. One of the nastiest, most terrifying knockouts I've ever seen. But he went toe-to-toe with Jerome LeBanner and got up time after time. Don Fry was an absolute animal. And I feel like he'd have to lean on a lot of that toughness against today's competition. But, man, why do I feel like he'd be kind of a journeyman against today's guys? Because he kind of just would, man. It's just the style. You rely too much on a chin and toughness, especially at those heavier weight classes. Not every fight's going to be like Takayama. These guys aren't going to call their tie with you and exchange shots like that. They're not going to engage in that. They're going to stay at a distance and pick you apart. So as much as I hate to say it, because I love Don Fry, right? The style, same as Dan Severn. I think he'd do better than Dan Severn, but yeah, I don't think he would go very far in the UFC as things currently stand. Mark Coleman, I'm thinking same thing. Dude. I know he's a legend. I do. Trust me, guys. I understand he's a legend. And compared to those standards back in the day, he was amazing, right? Back in the day, Mark Coleman was amazing. He's a legend. No one can take that away from him. But when you just compare him to current heavyweights, current 205ers, he wouldn't be able to compete, in my opinion. Sakuraba, I think early retirement. Same argument as with Royce Gracie. Yeah, Sakuraba would not do very well in today's landscape. He would get beat up. Yeah, I don't have to describe him, man. Fucking jiu-jitsu, if that's all you have, you cannot go far in the sport as things stand, because people have wised up. People have improved their jiu-jitsu. Having a jiu-jitsu black belt isn't even really an impressive feat anymore. It seems like everyone has a jiu-jitsu black belt. It's all about the level of jiu-jitsu that you display, right? Having a black belt on its own doesn't really mean much at all. But Sakuraba was tough as nails. So as far as early retirement goes, I don't want to put Sakuraba there because I respect him so much. He is a legend, an absolute legend. But yeah, if you're that one-dimensional in today's landscape, you're going to get beat up. And before one of you geniuses in the comments say it, I understand that Sakuraba technically was not a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I understand that he technically wasn't a black belt, but that's exactly my point, that having a black belt doesn't matter. Takanori Gomi. Now, I can see him doing pretty well at featherweight, to be honest. Man had fast hands. Truly, truly fast hands. The dude was lightning quick. He was called the Fireball Kid for a reason. You know what, dude? I think currently, you put him up against a guy like Dan Ige. I think he could have success. Put him up against a guy like Lerone Murphy. I think I could have success. Why did I mention them? Is it because they're fighting this weekend? Yeah, probably, and they're on my mind. But I can see Takanori Gomi at least breaking into the top 15 of the current 145 roster. Forrest Griffin, I believe, would be a journeyman. I can't disrespect him that much to the point where I say that he'd have an early retirement, because I think he would be able to grind out some results against guys just outside the top 15, maybe just break into the top 15, but honestly, like the skill set, he wasn't good enough at any single thing. He was pretty decent at everything, but not good enough at one thing. He wasn't a specialist in anything. And for me, Forrest Griffin would just about be a journeyman. Tim Sylvia, this dude leaned a lot on his size. He was a massive gargantuan heavyweight, like 6'8" beast. Got fucking finished. Or wait, did he get finished by Randy Couture? I actually don't remember if he was finished by old man 44-year-old Randy Couture. But I believe that he really got by, not on skill but on size. I don't think he'd be a top fiver. I think his size is matched. Like we have Volkov now, right? Size and technique and genuine striking ability. I don't think Tim Sylvia is all that great. Yeah, like we even have guys like Robles Despain. Robles Despain would probably chin him at some point. You know what? Yeah, I think Tim Sylvia overall would just end up being a journeyman, to be completely honest with you guys. Ken Shamrock, I'm going to say probably early retirement. I think somebody would beat him into the living death at some point.
I hope to God you come ready. Because if you don't, I'm going to beat you into the living death.
So I'm gonna say early retirement for him. And then we get into his brother Frank Shamrock. Now he was a little bit better, but I still think that he would be a journeyman. I still think he'd be a journeyman. They both weren't great. I shouldn't put him at the very top of journeyman. I'll put him at the very bottom, maybe just ahead of Tim Sylvia. Now I respect the Shamrock brothers. They were kind of pioneers of MMA, but at the same time, when you go back and you watch them fight back then, and then compare them contextually to current fighters around their weight classes, dude, they would have got fucked up pretty bad. Honestly, Frank Shamrock would probably be down here, early retirement, along with his brother. They were good for the times, but that is about it. And once again, I don't mean any disrespect by it. Rory McDonald, now I think he would be a top fiver as things currently stand, dude. He was so good. He was genuinely great. I don't care what anyone says. He was beating up Robbie Lawler. He just took too much damage in that fight. I know they fought twice, but I'm talking about the one that you all know I'm talking about. Genuinely great on the feet. He beat up a prime Tyron Woodley. He beat up Tyron Woodley really bad. Completely dominated him. And he was capable of doing that to everybody. When I think about 170-pound guys in the top 5 right now, I can see him beating Leon. I can see him giving serious problems to Shavkat. I can see him giving serious problems to JDM. And I could see him beating Bilal Muhammad because he was a great grappler on his own and would have a massive striking advantage over Bilal. Dude, honestly, you know what? Roy McDonald would be a champion. He would be a champion in today's landscape because I believe he was always destined to be a champion. So I think you take him, you take how well-rounded he was. He was kind of like a slightly, maybe not slightly worse, but a worse version of GSP. But I think even a worse version of GSP can beat Bilal Muhammad as things stand. So I believe that Rory McDonald could become champione at 170 pounds. Ricardo Arona, this dude was just sheer muscle. That's all he was. So technically to compete in the UFC right now, he would have to get off of the obvious steroid cycle that he was on. But then again, maybe that's not true, seeing as we have guys like Israel Adesanya walking around with full-on female breast tissue forming. So maybe that's not true. But at the end of the day, Ricardo Arona did have some pretty impressive wins under his belt, but a lot of what he did just came from his overall size and athleticism and strength that he had. I think he'd be a journeyman at the end of the day, maybe pushing top 15, maybe, but didn't really have a lot in terms of technique, and I think he would, he would swing everything from the hip, and I believe he would just get chinned at some point early on in a lot of his fights. And then we get into Sean Sherk, man, the muscle shark. How would he do against current lightweights, welterweights? I don't know, in all honesty, because he's one of those fighters who deserves to be spoken about when it comes to the greatest fighters to never win a belt. Let me tell you who he's lost to. Sean Sherk, I believe he's 36-4. I think 1 draw on his record. Sean Sherk has only lost to Matt Hughes, George St. Pierre, BJ Penn, and Frankie Edgar. Those are his only losses. He's beaten every other opponent he's come up against. Sean Sherk was legit. His stand-up sucked. It really did. His stand-up fucking sucked. He did not have good hands. But as a wrestler, he was so good, so dominant, so smothering, and on so much steroids. You know what? I rate Sean Sherk's ability to at least break into the top 15 in this current lightweight landscape. Like if guys like Clay Guida are still performing right now at 155, still competing, and still able to pick up wins every now and then, there's no reason why Sean Sherk could not become a top 15 fighter, the way I see it. That is the tier list as a whole. Please let me know in the comment section below if you agree, if you disagree with some of my placements, if you think I'm a casual, if you think I'm retarded, anything that you personally believe, you feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you on the next one.